On the night of March 21st, 2026, two Iranian ballistic missiles punched through the Israeli sky and landed in the southern cities of Dimona and Arad. 120 people were injured. A 12-year-old child was among the seriously wounded in Dimona. And the system that was specifically built, specifically funded, specifically co-designed to stop exactly those missiles, David's Sling, failed to intercept a single one of them. But here is the detail that every major outlet buried in paragraph 11. The detail that changes the entire meaning of what happened that night. The missiles that got through cost Iran somewhere between $500,000 and $2 million each. The interceptors that would have been fired to stop them cost between $1 and $15 million per shot. Iran didn't just hit two Israeli cities. Iran handed every defense planner in Washington a piece of paper with a number on it. And that number is the true cost of David's Sling. And what that number reveals about America's ability to defend its allies, and ultimately itself, is the story almost nobody is telling you correctly. Let me be precise about what David's Sling actually is, because the name has been used loosely and the confusion is part of the problem. David's Sling, Hebrew designation Kela David, originally nicknamed Magic Wand, is a joint Israeli-American air defense system. Rafael Advanced Defense Systems built it on the Israeli side. Raytheon built the other half on the American side. It became operational in April 2017. It was never designed to replace Iron Dome. That is a persistent mischaracterization. Iron Dome handles short-range rockets and artillery shells, threats flying between 4 and 70 kilometers. David's Sling sits in the middle tier, designed to intercept ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and heavy rockets traveling between 40 and 300 kilometers. It was built to replace the aging Patriot and MIM-23 Hawk systems in the Israeli arsenal. The threats it was explicitly designed to defeat include Iranian Fatah family ballistic missiles and Hezbollah's Fateh 110, a GPS-guided rocket with a 250 to 300 kilometer range, and a 450-kilogram warhead that Iran has been quietly mass-producing inside Lebanon since at least 2012. So when those two Iranian missiles flew toward Dimona and Arad on the night of March 21st, they flew directly into the intercept envelope David's Sling was built to cover. And they landed anyway. To understand why that failure matters far beyond Israel, you need to understand who actually built this system and what they needed it to prove. The United States is not a passive donor to David's Sling. The U.S. Missile Defense Agency and the Israeli Missile Defense Organization signed a joint development agreement in 2006. From that point forward, the Americans were co-managers, not just check writers. Between fiscal years 2006 and 2020, the United States contributed approximately $1.99 billion to Israeli missile defense programs, with at least $1.39 billion allocated specifically to David's Sling. Raytheon manufactures 50% of the system's components, including the stunner interceptor and its vertical launcher. And in November 2025, just 4 months before the Dimona failures, Raytheon secured an approximately $1.25 billion contract with Rafael to produce U.S.-built Iron Dome interceptors under the designation Skyhunter. Former U.S. Missile Defense Agency Director, Lieutenant General Henry Obering, was unusually candid about Washington's real stake in this program. In July 2013, standing at the Paris Air Show, he said publicly, and I'm quoting directly, "We wanted a truly co-managed program because the United States will be very interested in this for our own purposes, not for Israel's purposes, for America's purposes." David's Sling was always the prototype for something larger, and when it failed on March 22, 2026, it wasn't just an Israeli problem. It was a live-fire stress test of the architecture Washington intends to deploy across the Pacific. Now here's where the timeline becomes important, because the silence around these failures is not accidental. On February 11, 2026, exactly 40 days before the Dimona and Arad strikes, Moshe Patel, the director of the Israeli Missile Defense Organization, made high-profile public statements praising David's Sling's test results. 6 weeks earlier, Rafael CEO Yoav Torgerman had publicly praised the system's February upgrade tests. The USMDA and IMDO conducted those joint tests together. Both governments were on the record vouching for the system's readiness. And then on the night of March 21st to 22nd, 2 missiles got through the specific tier those tests were supposed to validate. The question you have to ask is this: if 2 governments had just co-certified a system 6 weeks before it failed in live combat, what is the incentive for either government to publicize the precise nature of that failure? Raytheon had $1.25 billion in new contracts sitting on the table. The USMDA had staked its institutional credibility on co-management, and both governments had planned to use this architecture as the export template for allied defense networks from Eastern Europe to East Asia. The silence had a price tag on it, and that price tag had a name: the Stunner Interceptor. But let me tell you what actually happened on March 22nd, because the mechanics of the failure are more revealing than the politics around it. Iran didn't fire 2 missiles at Israel that night. Iran fired approximately 440 ballistic missiles between February 28th and late March 2026. During the June 2025 12-day war alone, Iran had launched 500 to 550 ballistic missiles. Up to 70% of those barrages were cluster munition warheads, a design choice that munitions expert N.R. Jensen-Jones described in blunt terms. He said Iranian designers, and I'm quoting here, probably turned to a high-altitude dispersal approach in part to minimize the chance of a successful ground-based interception. Read that sentence carefully. Iran's engineers studied David Sling's lower-altitude engagement envelope, identified the ceiling below which the system struggles, and deliberately designed a warhead release profile that exploits it. This was not a lucky shot. This was engineered incompatibility. Iran reverse-engineered the gap. Former IDF Air and Missile Defense Commander Ron Kochov gave the most detailed public account of what happened that night. His explanation pointed to something that Missile Defense Advocacy Alliance analyst Tal Inbar had already framed with uncomfortable clarity. Inbar stated publicly, "The number of interceptors of every type is finite." What Kochov described was a triage problem. Israel was simultaneously managing Arrow 3 engagements, THAAD coverage, and David's Sling allocations across hundreds of incoming threats. Defense commanders were making real-time decisions about which system to assign to which missile. Arrow 3 intercepts exoatmospherically, outside the atmosphere, and costs between roughly $650,000 and $3 million per shot, depending on the source. THAAD carries its own cost structure and its own finite stockpile. The June 2025 12-day war alone consumed an estimated 150 THAAD interceptors, burning through approximately a quarter of the entire U.S. stockpile in a single conflict. By the time Iranian missiles were tracking toward Dimona, the intercept triage algorithm, whether human or procedural, assigned the wrong resource or no resource. And Dimona is not a random southern Israeli city. The Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center sits approximately 20 kilometers away. Iran did not pick that target casually. Now I want you to hold all of that and look at the single number on the thumbnail behind this video: $1 million per kill. Because that number is where the strategic argument becomes existential. Iran's ballistic missiles cost between $500,000 and $2 million to manufacture and launch. David's Sling Stunner interceptors cost between $1 and $15 million per shot. In a one-for-one engagement, Iran is either at cost parity or profitable. But Iran doesn't fire one missile. Iran fires barrages, 440 missiles in a month, 550 missiles in 12 days. When you fire in saturation volleys, you're not just trying to get warheads through, you're trying to drain the interceptor magazine. You're running an economic attack disguised as a missile attack. Every stunner that chases a decoy or a cluster munition, submunition, or a missile that was never going to hit a critical target is $1 million subtraction from a stockpile that takes months to replenish and a factory in Tucson, Arizona to rebuild. And Israel entered the March 2026 engagements, already carrying Arrow interceptor shortfalls. The result of an unresolved production dispute between Israel's defense ministry and Israel Aerospace Industries. The magazine was already below full before the first missile of that campaign was launched. Hezbollah understood this equation before most Western analysts were willing to say it out loud. Iran has operated at least 2 underground Fateh 110 production facilities in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley since approximately 2012. One of those facilities, a tunnel complex 1.4 kilometers long near the town of Janta, was destroyed by the IDF in late 2024. But the production infrastructure Iran built underground in Lebanon over a decade was never designed to survive one strike. It was designed to produce faster than it could be destroyed. Hezbollah's arsenal of Fateh 110 missiles, GPS-guided 300-kilometer range, 450-kilogram warhead, is the exact threat class David Sling was architected to defeat, and those missiles cost a fraction of what it costs to intercept them. On March 28, 2026 alone, Hezbollah fired approximately 250 rockets at Israeli targets in a single day. That is a single day's consumption of a stockpile David Sling was designed to counter. The math is not close. And here is what makes this more than an Israeli problem. Lieutenant General Obering's 2013 quote was not diplomatic filler. The United States has a direct operational interest in whether David Sling works, because Washington's entire defensive architecture for the Western Pacific is built on the same layered intercept logic. THAAD batteries in South Korea and Japan, Patriot batteries on Okinawa, naval SM-3 interceptors on Arleigh Burke destroyers in the Philippine Sea. The theoretical foundation underneath all of them is identical to David's Sling, a tiered mid to upper range intercept network capable of defeating ballistic missile volleys from a state adversary. China has spent approximately 15 years studying every publicly available detail of how Israel's layered defense performs under pressure. The People's Liberation Army Rocket Force currently operates approximately 3,000 ballistic and cruise missiles. Taiwan sits 90 miles off the Chinese coast. The intercept geometry from the Chinese mainland to Taipei is significantly shorter than the geometry from Lebanon to Tel Aviv. China's DF-15 short-range ballistic missile is literally named in David Sling's own threat assessment documents as a design target. When Iran fired 440 missiles at Israel and the mid-tier intercept layer failed over Dimona, Beijing's analysts were not watching as neutral observers. They were taking notes. The IDF's official position, delivered by JCS Chairman General Dan Kane on April 8, 2026, was that 80% of Iran's ballistic missile production facilities had been destroyed. And that statement may be accurate, but it obscures the central question this conflict forced into the open. The issue was never whether Israel could destroy enough Iranian missile factories. The issue is what happens in the window between factories destroyed and magazine restocked, and what happens to any allied defense network when the enemy has correctly calculated that saturation costs less than interception. Iran did not break David's Sling on March 22nd. Iran revealed that David's Sling was breakable. And it revealed it at a moment when the United States still has THAAD batteries distributed across the Pacific, when U.S. stockpiles are already depleted from a 12-day Israeli war, and when the production lines that fill those stockpiles are running on a peacetime industrial schedule that no one in the Pentagon has publicly acknowledged cannot sustain a Taiwan Strait scenario. There is a detail in the public record that I want you to carry with you out of this video, because it is the detail that reveals the real shape of what Iran did. On February 11th, 2026, Moshe Patel stood in front of cameras and told the world that David's Sling had passed its latest upgrade tests. 40 days later, 2 missiles landed in Dimona and Arad. In between those 2 events, Raytheon had locked in $1.25 billion in new production contracts. The U.S. and Israeli governments had jointly certified the system's readiness. And somewhere in Tehran, inside an IRGC targeting cell, planners were finalizing the flight parameters of 2 Ghadar family ballistic missiles at an altitude profile designed to exploit the exact ceiling below which David's Sling operates. They knew what they were shooting at. They knew what they were shooting through. And they knew that when those missiles landed, every defense contractor, every ministry spokesperson, every allied government that had vouched for this system 6 weeks earlier would have a commercial and political reason to keep the precise nature of the failure out of the headline. That is the true cost of David's sling. Not $1 million per interceptor, not $1.39 billion in U.S. funding. The true cost is the gap between what these systems are certified to do in a press release and what they can actually sustain against an adversary who has spent a decade engineering the arithmetic of your defeat. Iran did not win that night because its missiles were better. Iran won that night because it understood the economic geometry of modern air defense better than the institutions paid to defend against it were willing to publicly admit. And if Washington does not reckon with that, honestly, not in classified after-action reports that stay buried, but in actual industrial and strategic policy, then the next test of that same architecture will not be over Dimona. It will be over somewhere the United States has legally committed to defend, and the cost per kill counter will still be running.